Fran Townsend is a CBS News national security consultant and former Homeland Security and counterterrorism advisor to President George W. Bush. She joins us on the phone from Washington, D.C. Fran, we are learning that ISIS has claimed responsibility for this shooting. What do you make of the nature of this attack?
You know, Vlad, this is consistent with what I call the kind of pickup game that ISIS has been running both in Europe and frankly around the world in the attack we saw in the UK, you know, where they'll use common objects. So here it's a gun, but, you know, in the UK it was a car. They'll use knives. They use the truck in Nice and the truck in the Germany Christmas market. And so it seems like more of a pickup game. You mentioned the ISIS claim of responsibility. The interesting thing about that is how quick it was. It suggests either ISIS well knew about this attack in advance to be able to have a statement so quickly prepared, or this is not, you know, they've claimed responsibility, but maybe in fact they've just gotten a better media operation to be able to make a claim like that, regardless of whether or not it's true, if they want to adopt it as their own. And so it's not clear. This is the quickest ISIS claim of responsibility we've seen in response to one of these attacks. And so it did come out from Amaq, their alleged news agency, but it's very curious. You know, I think investigators now will look to see if there were closer ties than they might have realized before.
And Fran, you know that France has been on high alert since the 2015 attacks. First in January, Charlie Hebdo, then in November 2015, the attacks on the Bataclan and other areas there, and then again in July of 2016 in Nice. This gunman was reportedly known to law enforcement, and yet he managed to get into the country, possibly through Belgium. That is speculation, but that is what some are speculating right now, numerous news outlets. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't. Look, you know, oftentimes the perpetrator, the terrorist in Nice, was also known to investigators. In that instance, it was for minor petty offenses, larcenies, you know, drug-related, that sort of thing. We don't know enough yet about why he was known to police. We do know from the two of the attacks you mentioned, Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan, that there are ties between these groups in Europe, between France and Belgium. And so we know that there's a cell in Belgium that has been quite active. And of course, there was the attack they perpetrated directly on the Brussels airport. And so this is a trans-European problem, and the European security services have been working to better share information about individuals of interest, but no doubt they're going back to look, how did they miss this guy, and how did he get into the country to perpetrate this attack?
And so, Fran, in the meantime, what can countries like France do to prevent these types of attacks? I mean, we saw this happen just recently in London, a person in a car, and we mentioned the attack in Nice, which also involved a moving vehicle. You know, beyond knowing that there are potential jihadis on watch lists in Europe, how can people feel safe in these countries, France, Belgium, and others?
So I think it's very difficult. There's a real challenge for the services in Europe, just as there are challenges for our own services here in the United States. This is when you talk about watch lists or persons of interest, that's a huge population of people. And what you're asking your security services to do is sift through that and make judgments about who is most likely to act and who's a near-term threat as opposed to a long-term or potential threat. And they're going to get that wrong sometimes. What they need is, one, the help of local communities to, you know, sort of tell them things that are odd or people acting in odd ways, right, or purchasing materials that might be an indication of an impending terror attack. The second thing is, and they know this, the European services, they have to learn to share intelligence and targeting information real time prior to an event. And that continues, I think, to bedevil them, just as it did here in the United States pre 9/11.
And Fran, let me just ask you, is there something to be learned from how the Israelis sometimes conduct investigations and how they watch potential terror suspects that essentially surround that country. And I know that in America and even in France, where I lived for many, many years, the idea of racially profiling or ethnically profiling or profiling on religious reasons is an affront to many people. But when you see incidents like this and you realize that there probably needs to be a deeper understanding of the folks that are trying to perpetrate these acts, is there something perhaps not as stringent as profiling in the way that the Israelis do, but that we can learn from, or that the French can learn from that country?
Well, Vlad, I'll tell you, when I was in government, we spent a good amount of time with our allies in Israel because we wanted to see if there were things we could learn from them. Of course, we've got to remember Israel is sort of geographically so small compared to France or obviously the United States. And truthfully, intelligence-based targeting is the single most effective way. I mean, just this week there was a search, a terrorism investigation, and a related search in Marseille in France, where they seized guns and other weapons, and it was a terror-related investigation. And so, one of the things, no doubt, the French authorities are looking at is, was that related? Because, of course, you're trying to not only follow people, but because guns and weapons are limited in France, you're also going to trace the weapons and where did they come from, and can you find a larger cell that may have supported this guy?
You make a good point there, Fran, about the size of France vis-a-vis the very, very small state of Israel. Fran Townsend, always great to get your analysis and your take on things. Thank you.
Thanks, Vlad.